I met a Buddhist monk in upstate New York.
It's in fact the prominence of meditation.
He was born Jeffrey Block in 1944. Today he goes by another name.
Monk at that time, I had to go to the other side of the world, to leave the United States to go to Sri Lanka. And that had it caused a lot of sorrow and anger on the part of my parents. So that was a great difficulty that I had to face when I was living in Sri Lanka. I would get regular letters from my mother saying, please come back. Oh, we're so stricken with grief. It's just as if you had died, we would be able to accept it more easily.
And you understand that. She's your mom, right?
Yeah.
She loved you. She
yeah.
didn't want you to face harm.
She wanted me to live. Why can't you live a normal life and be a normal human being?
And what was a normal human being?
Well, she would have wanted me to become a medical doctor or a lawyer and get married, and especially to give her grandchildren and to be a respected member of the community.
For our viewers, do you mind telling them, who are you?
Who am I?
Yeah.
Maybe you know who I am.
I know that you're Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi.
That's what they call me.
What does that mean?
That's just a name.
And where are we?
Okay, where we are is easier to answer.
Yeah.
So this is a place that's called Chuang Yen Buddhist Monastery. It's a large monastery in upstate New York. It's following basically the Chinese Buddhist tradition. And it's a place where I've been living since 2007.
And if a kid had to ask you, what does a Buddhist monk do, you would say what?
He eats, he sleeps, so those are not the main activities of the monk. The main activities of the monk, I would say for myself, to study the teachings of the Buddha, and in my case, since I've been an elder monk, doing some teaching, writing, translation, and meditation. So those are the main duties, is to study, teach, to practice meditation, and also to serve as a model for those who are interested in Buddhism or those who are following Buddhism.
Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi is the founder of Buddhist Global Relief and a leading advocate for Engaged Buddhism. Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi, what is the most important problem with the world today?
I'd say overwhelmingly the main problem, which is sort of the umbrella on which all of the other problems are founded, is the problem of climate change. But we also have to recognize that the continued escalation of climate change is also rooted in certain deep fundamental flaws in the reigning economic model, which gives primacy to the pursuit of profit, of financial profit over all other goods. So I sometimes say that we could think of the most valuable things in a mundane sense in our world is the preservation of the natural environment and the preservation and the enhancement of human life in a kind of equitable way, a way which will give everybody in this world a chance to flourish. But this kind of economic model that places the pursuit of increasing profits and economic growth above all other goods is functioning a bit like a parasite that latches on to the natural environment and to human relations and subsumes the pursuit of those goods to the pursuit of financial profit. And so we see that even though the people at the heads of the fossil fuel corporations are certainly extremely well-educated people, so they have to understand that by continuing to exploit, to explore for fossil fuels, to promote them, to sell them, that we're destroying the very prospects of human life on this planet. They clearly understand this, but they are operating within the framework of an economic model, which is, as I said, directed to the pursuit, the sort of continuous pursuit of economic growth and profit, and it's a short-term pursuit of profit rather than pursuing even long-term economic viability.
If I had to read this in black and white,
Yeah.
without a name attached to it, I think it's a Bernie Sanders quote and not a Buddhist monk.
Yeah,
Tell me why this Buddhist monastic and scholar
yeah.
feels the need to engage with these issues when a lot of us presume Buddhist monastics are just working on themselves, trying to reach nirvana, trying to shut it all out and just flow in peace and harmony.
First, I would say that this is even a very short-sighted and limited view of the nature of Buddhism itself, and a very limited view of the vocation of a Buddhist monk. Even if we go back to the time of the Buddha, though of course conditions were very different. At that time there were probably not even 1 billion people on the planet Earth, maybe just a few 100 million people. But the Buddha, it's said in the text that the Buddha arises in this world out of compassion for the world, for the good welfare and happiness of all sentient beings. And so it seems if we take that guideline, even of original Buddhism, to pursue the welfare and happiness of living beings, especially human beings, we have to say, like, what are the driving forces of suffering in the world today? And I say that things like climate change and this extremely vast economic disparities between a small, extremely wealthy, privileged elite and great billions of people who are living just on the edge of poverty, that is something that appeals, that sort of stirs up, I would say, the waves of compassion in the heart. And so out of a concern for the well-being of humanity and other life forms, not only human beings, we have to look at these wider issues that are impacting on the life of people today and use the principles of the Buddha's teaching as a way of examining them, analyzing them, and proposing alternative solutions.
Well, tell me more about Buddhist Global Relief and the work you do.
Yeah, so this goes back to the year 2007. There's a Buddhist magazine in North America called Buddha Dharma. It's actually published in Canada. And that year they asked me to write an editorial essay. And so one of the things that struck me, and it's been disturbing me over the years after I came back to the US, was the way Buddhists in the US think that the whole practice of Buddhism is just turning inward in this personal quest of meditation. Whereas the way I observe Buddhism in action in Asia, the Buddhists were very actively involved in the society. So I wrote an essay which was titled "The Challenge to Buddhists," in which I criticized that rather narrow, almost narcissistic approach to the Western adaptation of Buddhism, and said that it's important for Buddhists to take greater action in promoting justice and greater equity and so forth. And some of my students read the essay and started to discuss with me the need that they felt also, the need to take greater action. And so we had some initial discussions, and we decided to form a Buddhist relief organization. And we were searching for a specific mission for the organization. And we decided to focus on the problem of global hunger and malnutrition, which is spread around the world. And so initially we thought that the way to pursue that mission was to provide food assistance to hungry communities. But then as we looked into the roots of hunger and malnutrition, we found that the underlying root is poverty, and in many traditional cultures, the subordinate status of girls and women. And so we developed a fourfold strategy for addressing the problem of chronic hunger. One is to provide direct food aid to those in need, but then another strand of the work is to promote the education of girls. And we have a number of projects which have helped girls to go through and finish high school, girls from the poorest strata in society to go through, finish high school, and even to go on to university studies. The third strand is to enable women to start right livelihood projects to earn more money to support their families, And then as the reality of climate change became more apparent, we've sponsored projects, promoted projects that promote ecologically sustainable models of agriculture. And so we started in 2008 with just 3 pilot projects. Maybe each one was about $3,000, $4,000. Now, most recently, I think we have about 60 projects in countries spanning from Vietnam, Cambodia, Mongolia, through India, several countries in Africa, Latin America, Haiti, and in the United States itself. And our annual budget now is about, on projects, is about 1,200,000.
That's brilliant. Why do you think mankind is still greedy, still exploiting others, still creating systems of inequality?
Okay, looking at this again from my Buddhist perspective, we would say that the Buddha says that the underlying sort of roots of unwholesome conduct and of distorted emotions, afflictive emotions, are greed, hatred, and delusion. In this case, maybe, of course, hatred is there, but it's a bit subordinate to greed, and particularly delusion, which we also call ignorance. So this is, I would say, the delusion that we can achieve happiness and well-being by acquiring more and more wealth, and I would say also more and more power, controlling power over other people, over the resources of the earth. And so especially people in positions of privilege and power are driven by that greed, that pursuit of ever more wealth and power for themselves. So we take, for example, maybe billionaires who might have $5 billion, $10 billion, but if they see that a competitor, another billionaire, has $15 billion, they're not content to be in the second place. They want to exceed the one who has $15 billion, but they're never going to use that money. It's just abstract figures. But the abstract figure takes root in the mind and creates that distortion of discontent if you have less, and the need to acquire more, no matter what one achieves.
Those with greed, those who are responsible for an element of exploitation, tend to have a lot of money, like the $15 billion you're talking about, tend to sometimes have armies, tend to sometimes have nuclear weapons. They wield immense power. How does your engaged Buddhism, your approach to resolving this, find a way against this Leviathan?
You know, as the number of engaged Buddhists in the world is very small, and compared to some other religious denominations, the number of Buddhists is relatively small. So I can't say that by force of numbers that we're going to be able to resolve the problems of the world. But what I would say is that we can present certain ideas, frameworks of analysis, of thinking, and ways of understanding in what direction does the true human good lie? How can we really achieve happiness? And if we seek happiness for ourselves, I would say, we also see that to be truly happy within ourselves, we have to work to promote the well-being and happiness of others. If I just live within sort of the narrow framework of thinking exclusively of pursuing my own happiness, my own welfare, and I turn my back upon other people, then I'm never going to be able to find happiness. And so I say one of the sort of keys to resolving this problem that Buddhism can offer is to see that in order to achieve our own true happiness, we have to take actions that will promote greater economic equity, greater environmental viability and sustainability, and to promote other values to replace the rather narrow, destructive, materialistic values, which now have gained dominance over so many cultures, including cultures which still are at least nominally rooted in traditional religions.
Can the ends ever justify the means? Can you ever violate the precepts of Buddhism in order to achieve a greater good?
I say that in a way that's a loaded question, because I would really have to consider specific cases, and I don't want to lay down an absolute decree saying that the end can never justify the means, since I could think of some cases, hypothetical cases, in which the end can justify, say, even an act of violence. If I could give an example, in the United States in recent years, we've had these cases of a crazed shooter, gunman comes into a school, into a shopping mall, and starts shooting people at random. Okay, so a basic precept of Buddhism is not to kill, not to inflict physical harm on anybody. But if a policeman comes on the scene and he's adhering to the principle of nonviolence, the shooter is just going to go on shooting more people. So I would say in that case, it's the obligation of the policeman to take out the shooter in order to preserve the life of those other people.
In the modern world, people have been used to people committing atrocities in the name of Christianity, for example.
Yeah, this is
in the name of Islam, for
yeah.
example. Something that seems to be a newer phenomenon and something that a lot of people are wrestling with is, for example, in a place like Myanmar, where they come across Ashin Wirathu, one of the Buddhist monks, who says inflammatory things about Rohingya Muslims, which ends up in people being killed, deported, ethnically cleansed. What is your role as a Buddhist leader in tackling this when it comes to those who believe in a form of ethnic hatred, tribal hatred, religious hatred, nationalistic hatred, and even might support violence for the greater good in their minds, covered up under the guise of Buddhism, or, in their opinion, justified by Buddhism?
Yeah, I would say that hatred can never be justified on Buddhist principles. And the kind of action that some of these monks in Myanmar have been engaging in, inflaming ethnic hatred, religious hatred, that's completely contrary to the principles of Buddhism, or at least the classical principles of Buddhism. The Buddha always says that we should have, we call this metta, loving kindness towards everybody, and we should never allow differences of belief, differences of ways of life, obstruct our ability to establish cordial and friendly relations with others. So I'd say that somebody like this the monk Ashin Wirathu in Myanmar, though he claims to be acting as a Buddhist monk, but I'd say he's just a demagogue, a nationalistic, racist demagogue, who's really advocating a kind of racist-based spew of hatred, rather than acting in accordance with true Buddhist principles.
Mm-hmm. When there are politics, when you have ethnic divisions, when you have disputes, historical disputes over borders, I mean, with Myanmar, a lot of the historical roots come from the legacy of the British versus the Japanese, for example, in the region. When you have all of this, and you have a religion in the midst of it all, how does Buddhism stop itself from being used as a tool by demagogues, for example?
I'd say that this would be the responsibility of those monks within the country who truly understand the principles of the Buddha Dharma, of the Buddha's teaching, and are willing to speak up and to advocate the true, genuine principles of loving kindness, harmony, understanding, collaboration, cooperation, rather than creating more intense divisions, conflict, and enmity. And I know that there are such monks in Myanmar who do, stand up and represent the genuine principles of Buddhism. Unfortunately, and this is true, it's been true to some extent in Sri Lanka as well, it's maybe the voices of those monks who get the most prominence in the international media, but there are monks and probably nuns that really deeply committed to the principles of loving kindness, collaboration, cooperation, but they just don't, maybe they're a bit shy of speaking up in public, and maybe they simply don't get as much publicity as the rabble rouses.
Does that galvanize you even more in your duty to speak up?
Yeah, though as I mentioned earlier, I don't have that deep a connection with Myanmar Buddhism, but I have spoken up on, there is a podcast called Better Burma, and the person who runs that podcast, Joa McGee, who lives in the United States, he's interviewed me a few times. More recently, he's interviewed me about how Buddhists should respond to the oppressive dictatorial government in Myanmar.
And how should they?
I said that they have to resist that government in whatever way they can. The rather tragic course of events recently is that when the Buddhists stand up to resist that government, the military leaders send their troops out into the streets and they just shoot the protesters right on the street, shoot them dead. And I don't know what is the solution to that problem in Myanmar now.
I want to take us back to our hypothetical billionaire who has $15 billion. Nowadays, it's quite likely that that same billionaire does some form of Buddhist meditation, possibly, has an app, a mindfulness app.
Yeah.
How do you feel about this explosion of a sort of secular version of some of the psychological aspects of Buddhism for self-improvement in this day and age?
Okay, so what has happened in Western countries, perhaps even in traditional Buddhist countries as well, is that certain Buddhist practices, particularly the practice of, we used to call it meditation, but now they've taken it out and maybe meditation has too many religious connotations. So they've pulled the meditation out and now they call it simply mindfulness. So they've taken that out and they made it almost a kind of autonomous practice, severing its traditional roots or its classical roots in Buddhism. I would say that if it can bring, I don't object to that itself, if it's used with a grounding in basic ethics and it's pursued in a way that doesn't cut across some of the ethical principles of the Buddha Dharma. And if it brings some calm and peacefulness to people who might be otherwise stressed, anxious, depressed, worried, and so on, I don't have objections to that. Though what I object to is when some interpreters, and we find these in the United States, say that all of the rest of Buddhism, the Buddhist doctrine, Buddhist ethics, the Buddhist belief system, that is all just Asian cultural baggage that we have to discard.
Part of the cosmology of the world that the Buddha grew up in.
Yeah. And then they just say that the real essence of Buddhism is just the practice of mindfulness. And so we can take that out, discard the rest, and think that this is the true Buddha Dharma. And the rest is just cultural embellishments. Yeah, that is something that I would object to.
So I guess maybe let's try and sort of separate this out. All things considered, if you're meditating for a couple of hours a day, you're less likely to be killing and stealing and doing terrible things.
Yeah.
But if that mindfulness meditation means that you are able to pacify your conscience for the 500 employees that you just fired, then that mindfulness is not rooted in anything Buddhist.
Yeah, I would say that is a rather selfish and very limited and maybe even a distorted application of mindfulness, or misappropriation of mindfulness.
You were not born in the saffron robes as Venerable Bhikkhu Bodhi?
I don't think any monk, Asian monk has been born in saffron robes,
How did Jeffrey Block, the kid from Borough Park in Brooklyn, end up here? How did it happen, and has it been a journey that's been worthwhile?
It's certainly been worthwhile. Okay, I grew up in a secular Jewish family in Brooklyn, New York. When I was in college, maybe junior year, senior year of college, I became interested in Buddhism, initially just by coming across books on Buddhism in the bookstore, and my curiosity was aroused. And then I started to read. I tried to meditate on my own, but didn't succeed. Then, after completing my undergraduate studies, then I went to graduate school in California, Claremont Graduate University. And the first year that I was there, a Buddhist monk from Vietnam came to study in the same university. And then I became friends with him. And through him, I was able to receive some instructions in meditation. And then I took him as my Buddhist teacher. And in that way, the idea took root in my mind that I wanted to become a monk myself. And so actually I became ordained as a novice monk in the Vietnamese system with him. And then a few years later, when I finished my graduate studies, then I went to Sri Lanka and I was ordained as a monk in the Sri Lankan Theravada tradition.
Bhante, I'm really grateful that you took the time to talk to us on the InnerView. Thank you very much.